It's now my great pleasure to introduce Chief Robert Joseph and Shaun Loney, and I will invite them to come on the stage when I'll introduce them. Chief Dr. Robert Joseph is a hereditary chief of the Gwawinhook First Nation who has dedicated his life to bridging the difference brought about by intolerance, lack of understanding, and racism at home and abroad. His insights into the destructive impact these forces can have on people's lives, families, and cultures were shaped by his experience with the Canadian Indian residential school system. He will be on stage with Shaun Loney, a long-time member of Canadian CED Network, also an Ashoka Fellow, the first in the Canadian Prairies, and an Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year in 2014. He has co-founded and mentored 11 social enterprises, including Build Incorporated. Shaun recently published An Army of Problem Solvers, his second book following Build Prosperity, Energizing Manitoba's Local Economy. Chief Joseph and Shaun, over to you.
Thank you. I've, with my partner Fiona, grown some tobacco at home in Treaty 1, and I've prayed with this tobacco, Chief Joseph, and I'd like to offer it to you.
Thank you, Shaun.
In hopes that we can have a conversation about reconciliation in the context of economic reconciliation especially. And I'd just like to start by asking you what seems like a simple question, but it's really the question that Canada is asking now, and that is, what is reconciliation to you?
Thank you, Shaun. That's the most important question that this country has to answer at this time. All of you probably remember that there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission report that was completed and submitted just a few years ago. And that report characterized what had happened to Aboriginal people, Indigenous people in this country as having experienced cultural genocide. And that was quite a strong indictment. But what was more exciting was a subsequent poll following that, the submission of that report that said, in spite of the characterization, and they agreed with it, 7 out of 10 Canadians wanted to reconcile. So now here in this country, we have a really huge momentum going on right across the country among Canadians and Indigenous people around the idea that we absolutely need to reconcile. And it's a very exciting time in our history. We need to continue the momentum. And one of the pillars, of course, of sustaining reconciliation will be economic reconciliation. But before all of that happens, there needs to be a relational shift. We need to restore a relationship between all of us, Aboriginal and all other Canadians. We need to have a dialogue among us that creates that deeper understanding that allows transformative change. And then we can begin to look at the systemic shortcomings that we currently operate under when it comes to Indigenous people. And of course, unemployment, poverty, despair are all in there. And the only way that we can mitigate these issues is to collaborate together around building wealth and sharing prosperity. And so it leads to the kind of ideas I've read in the background for EconoUS 2017. I'm really excited about the idea that the focus is on community, and that the focus is on creating thriving, vibrant communities that create resilience and prosperity. And if that's the focus, that's exactly, or the process, that's exactly the process we need, when we approach Indigenous communities, to bring them into the mainstream of development in this country. And I think it's really important to consider how we're going to do that.
So imagine it's the year 1905, and there's a man on horseback, and he's galloping along towards the lip of the Qu'Appelle Valley in Saskatchewan, and he's accompanied by RCMP escort, and he has some staff with him. His name is William Graham. William Graham is also known as Peg Leg Bill, because when he was a kid, he fell on an axe and cut off the bottom of his leg, replaced with a peg. Peg Leg Bill comes to the lip of the Qu'Appelle Valley, and he looks down, and there he sees 3,000 Indians. And around those Indians are the Hudson's Bay traders. The Hudson's Bay traders have these carts, are just groaning with the weight of merchandise. Peg Leg Bill has with him 15,000 $1 bills. It's treaty days in Fort Qu'Appelle. Each Indian gets 5 $1 bills. And you know what's going to happen? We've seen it in our communities today. The money goes to the Indigenous people, and as a coworker of mine says, it just slides off brown hands. The beneficiaries are the Hudson's Bay Company, the traders that are there. The customers are the Indians, and the power is with Peg Leg Bill, who is the Indian agent representing the Government of Canada. And to me, reconciliation is changing those relationships. Changing those relationships so that the power is with the Indigenous people and those that are marginalized in our communities. The customer is the federal government, and they are buying services from Indigenous people, including proper child welfare, which the elders tell me is keeping families together, not tearing families apart. Renewable energy and healthy food just being some examples. And this is our defining moment in Canada, the defining issue, connecting people who most need the work with the work that most needs to be done. And here we are in this room being a vehicle for that to happen. Social enterprises and nonprofits do exactly that. And so, Chief, I'd like to ask you, what does a future economy look like to you? What does an economy where we're in a country that has proper relations with each other, what does that look like in the future, now and in the future?
Well, thank you for that question. I wanted to start by mentioning that the scenario you just described has always been so since the coming of the first newcomers. Of course, we have always lived in our territories, and prior to the coming of newcomers, the resources in those territories we had access to, and we developed our own Indigenous forms and processes of economy. And all of that changed, of course, when Canada started to become a confederation, and we no longer had any more access to our own territories, and were marginalized on little reserves. But now we're here in this moment, this historical moment of reconciliation. The possibilities are endless. There are people, Canadians from coast to coast to coast, who are already engaged in reconciliation, and many others waiting to see how they can get involved in this process of reconciliation. And I think one of the ways that are one of the pillars for real sustaining reconciliation will flow from people like yourselves, people who have ideas about how industry, how economic development can change to be inclusive. And it's really important that we consider that when you're in Aboriginal country, and many of you are, that when you develop programs, economic development projects, that you don't come to that place with the same designs and formulas and attitudes that you've always come. You've got to find some way to embrace and embed in that process the additional value of indigenous people. It can't be the same old, otherwise we get the same old result. And one of the things I really like about this conference is that you talk about community-based economic development. That ought to be what it is. For all of the time that I've been growing up, there has been no recognition of our community and the economy in it, and we've been marginalized and dismissed. So now if we come together and we agree to collaborate, and it's community-based, and it involves all of our community. And if we can then pay attention to the idea that we should infuse contemporary context of economic development with some other ancient, traditional values and principles, that it has a real chance to work. And I see that coming out of our ability to begin to change our relationships with each other so that we can look each other in the eye, have discussions, begin to understand each other. You begin to understand why it is that we've been marginalized and why it seems that we can't get on our own 2 feet. And if we have these discussions, we're going to discover how to motivate all of us to be moving forward together in an economy that's community-based and community-designed, imbued with the values, with all of the people in that collective community. I think that's a really inspirational idea to be inclusive. In Canada, in general, we haven't been very inclusive, right?
I've just come home from a trip to Scotland, and there are 5,600 social enterprises in Scotland. It's 1 for every 1,000 people. And they've done that largely through, not so much through, well, as part of the ecosystem, they've done it largely through procurement and planning to do more and more procurement where governments are purchasing goods and services from social enterprises. Because, as you say, Chief Joseph, that we need to measure the value that we are bringing to the table in this room and across Canada, our partners that we have. And in fact, I was riding a double-decker bus in Edinburgh, and I began to just look to compete with my partner who was sitting next to me to try to see who could see the next social enterprise first. They have full plans to continue to ramp up the number of social enterprises that were there, and it really puts the community first. It acknowledges that inclusive growth is the way to move forward, and that we need an economy where everyone is included. And to me, it kind of described our future in Canada. And I know we have the federal government that is inching in that direction of updating their procurement practices, and certainly we'll welcome that day. In Manitoba, we have Manitoba Housing that does now $7 million a year business with social enterprises so that we can hire their tenants. And we've recently made a pitch that we ramp up the number of people on our social enterprise payrolls from 200 to 1,000 over 5 years, and that'll be largely done through social procurement. What I'd like to ask you, Chief Joseph, is could you just tell us some of the barriers you think that are preventing us from achieving this kind of economy here in Canada?
Yeah, I think that they're obvious and they're not always business-oriented barriers. I think old attitudes, old prejudices, racism are huge barriers. We recently concluded a nationwide poll among Indigenous people and ordinary Canadians, And what was really remarkable about what we found out was that they identified these barriers that I just mentioned as the most serious barriers to moving forward in any way. And I think we have no capital in many of our communities. So government and yourselves, those who wish to partner with us, need to invest and to collaborate really closely with our representatives. And I think that government, at one time, by the way, we had total access to resources throughout the territories that we claimed as traditional territories. Over all that time since then, we were herded on and marginalized in little reserves that for the most part, have no potential at all. And I think that government has to open up the doors a little, and in our collaboration, we have to be innovative and be able to find markets and resource areas we can develop together. We've not been players in any economy whatsoever.
The rules are certainly not stacked in your favor. One of the social enterprises that I've been fortunate enough to be involved with is called Aki Energy, and Aki is a Ojibwe word for earth, and we're installing geothermal on First Nations in Manitoba. And we've now installed $7 million worth of geothermal, all done by First Nation enterprises, and none of it involving the federal government, in that it's a financing, it's a business model. Manitoba Hydro provides us the money up front, and we install the geothermal, and Manitoba Hydro gets paid back out of the savings. And it was going so well that we made an announcement at the Wew'suwakapo Ojibwe Nation that we were going to do $8 million worth of geothermal, and $4 million of that would be on reserve labor. And we got this little email from the federal government saying, no, we're not going to permit you to do that. If you want to do geothermal on First Nations, you must apply for funding. And we have realized, and you'll see reading our book, Army of Problem Solvers, that it's our firm belief that these colonial rules have come out of Peg Leg Bill and his views of Indigenous people. Peg Leg Bill was one of the main people responsible for changing the Indian Act so that this activity we saw here, this drumming, was a jailable offense. And when Roy was telling us about him going to sleep crying at night and listening to all the other children crying, we're just coming to terms with this in Canada about how hard our government worked to take the Indian out of the child. And what I'm starting to realize is how hard the government was working to take the Indian out of the economy. And we're still doing it today. We set up Aki Foods to do local food at the Garden Hill First Nation, and discovered that Nutrition North Canada, federal government again, gives $1 million a year in subsidies to monopoly retailers that sell mostly unhealthy food. Aki Foods raises chickens, lots of vegetables, and is a real source of hope in northern Manitoba. Nothing that they do is eligible for the incentives, because in order to be eligible, you have to fly the food in from outside. It was part of the job of the Indian agent to ensure that there were no companies negatively impacted by economic activity on the res. This is going to stop, and we are going to stop it.
Can I just add a comment? I really appreciate your comment. I feel strongly that the road to reconciliation is going to involve us, you and I, where we live, small business, big business, industry, and not necessarily government. Of course, they have a lot of work to do, government to government, with our First Nations, and they need to resolve those things. But in the final analysis, if we want to live free with dignity and respect, it's going to be because we in the communities redeveloped our relationship and developed that sense of honor and respect for each other.
That's well said. So I'd just like to ask you, Chief, as a way to wind up, if you could share with all of us here what you think our next steps can and should be. And you've got our attention now. You've experienced things that most of us in this room have not, and we cannot know what that's like. But what advice would you have for us around reconciliation?
Thank you. I just got to tell you first, I spent 11 years in a residential school. It was brutal, and the impacts have been lifelong, and I'm still working on that issue. And there is no deeper desire for me than to move from that experience. And I know that the only way that I'm going to move from that experience is when we have a relationship, Canadians all, and where we have a society that really has equality and justice as an end goal. So now that you know what you now know as a result of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, you need to do what you're doing today. Listen and listen and listen and hear what Indigenous people are saying. I'm not an economist. I've never rubbed two nickels together even. But we have people in our communities who are good at that and who want to engage with you. And I think you should reach out to those people in those communities and just simply be good neighbors, neighborly. We're all in this together, and nobody's going to go away. One of the things I know for sure is that we're not going to cure the malaise in my community, the harm and the hurt and the brokenness without you. And we're not going to move ahead in ways that we want to and remove the stigma and the hatred and the racism and the prejudice unless we're working together. And unless I acknowledge and recognize your humanity too, and your value and your worth and your purpose. And ultimately, however this country turns out, it's already a good country. If it wants to be great, it'll be great because of us in this room and in our neighborhoods where we live, coming together to design economic development projects that belong to the people. And we can't circumvent that. I know the 94 recommendations. Like I said, they need to be met, and we're focusing on them. The problem with the limitation with that, it's between government official to government official, and it's not a people to people process. And if we continue on that path of just allowing government to be the ones to reconcile, we might lose this golden opportunity to make Canada one of the best countries in the world. We, in fact, can be a model for the rest of the world, I think, when we get this work done.
I like how you say, Chief Joseph, that our lives are intertwined, and I'm kind of hard on the Northern Store and the contribution that economic model is making to unemployment and diabetes in communities across Canada. My privilege largely comes from a grocery store that my family operates in northwestern Ontario, where I grew up, and because I didn't grow up in poverty, I had choices, and poverty takes our ability to choose away. And the largest block of customers that has shopped at my family's grocery store and continues to shop at my family's grocery store is from the local First Nation, the Rainy River First Nation. And so I've come to conclude that poverty and privilege go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. And so our lives are very much intertwined. And I also think it's important for those of us with privilege to realize where it's come from. And some of us were born on third base and think we hit a triple. And it's just really good to acknowledge that. And I honor the fact that people kept singing when they were told not to. I honor that the solutions to every economic problem we have are from your people. And you will lead and we will follow. We will go together to a place that's much better than where we are now. I also just want to say to those of you here that it seems to me that the most important thing that we can all give away is our love. That is unquestionable in my mind. We give it to our families and we give it to our communities. But the next most important thing we can give away is our time. And you do that here, you do it in your home communities and in this country. And for that it is a tremendous celebration that we're all here together. So in Treaty 1 we say miigwech, thank you. And let's have a great conference and learn from each other. Thank you.
Before you run away, just give us one quick moment. We just wanted to share with you a couple of gifts. Sorry, Shaun. I was trying to get my mic to work. Test, test. Thank you both for sharing, for your heartfelt words. Shaun's book, An Army of Problem Solvers, I really like that title, Problem Solvers. Because when I look out at all of us here today, I think of all of us as problem solvers. And we really see the opportunity ahead, the possibilities, as Chief Robert Joseph said, the possibilities that are in front of us. In this really important, timely conversation around reconciliation and what's possible ahead. So thank you so much.